I'm glad that we had a light meal, lunch. We didn't load up on carbs. That's a good thing. I appreciate all the food that was made. It's always a good time to spend together. I'm glad the elders have set aside that time for us to be together as a congregation. And table fellowship has always been a part of Christianity, and for good reason. The ultimate consummation when we are with Christ is referred to as a wedding feast. And I think that is intentional in showing us something about the relationship that the Lord wants us to have with Him. We live in a time when it is appropriate and allowable, and maybe even a little bit somewhat expected, to speak disrespectfully, and at times extremely disrespectfully, and other times crudely and harshly against positions of authority. Even the highest office in our land, it's kind of expected for individuals to speak in a very disrespectful way. Look at the way that individuals are talking about President Trump right now. Look at the way individuals talked about President Obama over the past 8 years. Sadly, it's become an aspect of American culture to speak disrespectfully and dishonorably of individuals who are in positions of authority or of higher rank or office than you. And this is really simply a symptom of a greater issue. And that is that we have created a culture of disrespect in American society. We have a vast majority of individuals who are never taught respect for governing authorities or respect for individuals who are in positions of authority. They were never taught how to decently exchange opposing ideas. They were never taught how to engage in conversation without being disrespectful, to disagree without being disagreeable. And so this is where we find ourselves. We see this manifested over the past several years in relationship to law officers. You know, the aggression against policemen has grown increasingly greater over the past few years. So much to the point that you wouldn't have imagined this 50 to 60 years ago. And this breakdown of respect for positions of authority and law may be one of the greatest signs of cultural deterioration, which ultimately will, if not kept in check, will lead to anarchy. And so when Paul, for example, spoke of cultural decline in Romans chapter 1, in the midst of all of these egregious sins, he mentions in Romans 1 and verse 30 disobedience to parents, which seems a little bit out of place to us who might not think it's that serious. But there's a systemic issue of disrespect which begins in the home. And I think that Paul understood that, and he addressed it in Romans 1 and verse 30. Peter later on would mention individuals in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 10 when talking about false teachers. He said they were individuals who despised authority. And so this aggressiveness against authority, this aggressiveness against office is really a symptom of a deeper issue. And sadly, this disrespect for authority and office, it many times transfers into the kingdom of Christ and into the church. And this is to be a place of respect, where Paul talks about in Romans chapter 12 and verse 10, where we outdo each other and showing honor to each other. He says there in Romans 12 and verse 10, outdo each other and showing respect to each other. So you have a kingdom that's supposed to be decent and respectful and honorable of each other, but yet, for example, you have wives in the church who speak very disrespectfully and down to their husbands, when they are explicitly commanded in Ephesians 5 and verse 33 to respect their husbands. You have children who rebel and speak disrespectfully and harshly to their parents, when they are explicitly commanded in Ephesians 6 verses 1 and 2 to submit and to obey and to honor their parents. You have members who talk behind the elders' back disrespectfully of them, when they're explicitly told in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17 to submit and to obey those leaders. And so this culture of disrespect has seeped into at times the church of Christ. Whereas we are to be a counter-community, counter-cultural. We are to be presenting a community where everyone is respected and shown with dignity, and where offices and authority that God has dictated are treated with the respect that He demands. And so I just was thinking about a few of these things in preparations for this afternoon's lesson. We won't stay long together as we usually don't on these services, but I just want to give you 3 principles concerning the virtue of respect that I think that we need to consider this afternoon. The first one being that respect is rooted in submission to God's sovereignty. Respect is rooted in submission to God's sovereignty. This is how we often view respect, if we're being honest. We often view respect in this way. If someone wants me to respect them, then they need to earn it. If they want me to respect them, then they need to earn that respect. And if they're acting in a way that's disrespectful, then I don't have to honor them, regardless of their office, regardless of their authority, regardless of their title. And no doubt, there's no doubt that leadership needs to learn that to rule with a hard hand is not to rule well, and that wisdom, grace, and patience and love are to be desired. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the assumption that someone must earn your respect in order for respect to be given is wholly unbiblical. It is anti-scriptural. That is not a scriptural mindset. In fact, it's a very American mindset. Respect for authority is rooted not in the respectability of the individual themselves, but in God's sovereignty and in His rule. In Romans 13 and verse 17, for example, when speaking of the governing authorities, Paul says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists God, what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment." Now, I want you to think for a moment that Paul is writing to a group of individuals who are under the rule of an emperor, who later on is not very kind to Christianity. Later on, Domitian will create a severe persecution. Nero, even before that, created severe persecution before Christianity. And yet he says that your relationship with the governing authorities is not based upon their respectability. It's rooted in God's sovereignty. These positions of authority that He has placed within creation are a reflection of His sovereign rule, and He has a system and a standard of law that He expects humanity to uphold. And later on in 1 Peter 2, Peter would say, honor the emperor. Honor him. Okay? And this is a man that was very antithetical to their belief system. And yet he tells them to honor them. Why? Because the emperor is so great and good? No. But because the position of authority demanded respect, because it was a reflection of God's sovereignty. So our submission to authority isn't a recognition of the inherent goodness of the individual, but it is a recognition of the inherent goodness of God Himself. It is a complete trust in His sovereign rule to maintain order through the governing powers. It's a trust in Him. That even though they might not be the best individuals that we would have hoped for, that eventually God's purposes will be fulfilled through them. And this is something we need to take note of every election cycle, and I'll try and remind us the next time this whole fun situation comes around in 4 years. And that is to trust God through the process. No problem with us taking part and getting involved, but eventually, no matter what happens, to trust in God to fulfill His purposes through those things. This kind of recognition is witnessed in the most extreme sense in Scripture when it refers to slaves and masters, which is an interesting discussion, but Paul does tell slaves to submit to their masters in Ephesians 6 and verse 5, even to those that are harsh. And that's a whole other discussion we can have, but the point being is that there is a greater issue at hand than simply our particular comfort, even in a slave-master situation. And that is a reflection of God's glory, even in difficult circumstances. And what this means, though, then, is if we believe this, and we should believe it because that's what the Bible teaches, is that respect and authority is rooted in God's sovereignty and God's rule, and not necessarily in the goodness or badness of the individual. What this then means, then, is that wives are expected to honor and respect your husband, irregardless if you think they deserve that respect. Irregardless if you think that they're a good husband or not. Your respect for them and your honor for them is not rooted in their inherent goodness as a husband. Now, we'll talk about that in a moment. But wives, you need to take note of that, because the Lord will hold you accountable for that if that continues. You submit to the decision of the elders, even if you might not necessarily agree with it. Now, I'm not talking about scriptural reasons. I don't think we would have an issue with our elders with that in the first place. But if it's a decision that you don't necessarily agree with on the elders, you submit to it. That is the instruction of Scripture. Submit and obey. It doesn't say submit and obey unless you don't like them. Right? And in children, it doesn't say submit and obey unless you think your parents are making a dumb decision. Then you get to rebel. That's not what it says. It says submit and obey. Okay, this is authority. We may not like it, but that's how it is. It's rooted in God's goodness and sovereignty. The second principle that we want to examine is that true authority reflects God's sovereignty and goodness. Now, it's rooted in God's sovereignty, but true authority is meant to reflect God's sovereignty and goodness. Now, while individuals who are in a submissive role must submit completely to that position of authority, this is not an excuse for abusive leadership. The Lord will hold leadership accountable as well. In fact, in the relationship of slaves and masters, He tells the masters, listen, you better not be severe with them, because you have a master in heaven who's going to hold you accountable with how you treat your slaves. And authority and leadership is best when it is closer, and when it closer reflects the sovereignty and the goodness and the love of God that it is patterned after. Throughout Scripture, God lets leaders know you're going to be held to a higher standard. He talks about this in Hebrews 13 and verse 17, for example, about the elders. He said, you're going to give account of the souls of the individuals that you're watching over. James says in James chapter 3 and verse 1 that individuals that take upon them the mantle of teacher are going to be held to a higher standard. Jacob's going to be held to a higher standard because I've taken on the mantle of teaching. Okay? And that's part of it. If you're going to take on that leadership role, God says, you are going to be held to a higher standard because you have been put in a very unique position to reflect the goodness and the mercy and the sovereignty of God. And because of that, you will be held to a higher standard. So elders, husbands, fathers must think about how they are leading. And ladies as well. If you're placed in a position of authority, whether at your job or even within your home, you have to reflect God's sovereignty and goodness in a way that will honor Him. So authority has to ask itself, how are you ruling? When people see you as a leader, do they see the goodness of God? Do they see grace and truth? Or do they see just sternness and rudeness? Are you ruling with a stern look or with a servant's heart? Are you ruling with a harsh tone or a gentle, humble strength? Are you ruling with love or bitterness? Are you simply dictating and demanding, or are you leading through example? Sheep are led. They're not driven. And so authority, although it is rooted in God's goodness, and authority must be respected irregardless of the inherent goodness of the individual, that is not an excuse for abusive leadership. In fact, what it means is because God requires His people to submit to positions of authority, that God will have very severe judgment on the individuals who abuse that authority. The third principle is this: that the virtue of respect must be cultivated in the home and in the church. That's the only place that it is going to be taught with a really successful rate. The home and the church must create a culture of respect. Parents and grandparents must demand respect from their children, and to show them first how to properly display it in their home as they interact with others, specifically in positions of authority. Young people need to be taught how to talk to adults, how to show respect to them in any culture that they're in. There are certain items of respect that are cultural that even they need to be taught. For example, in American culture, it is respectful to look someone in the eye as you talk to them and to stand still. Children need to be taught that. We're in the process of trying to teach our children that. Not so easy for, a 5-year-old. But it's our responsibility, it's my responsibility as a dad to teach my child how in our particular culture to respect positions of authority. And positions of authority now at their age is any adult, irregardless if they like them or dislike them. They like you guys, so that's okay. But irregardless, that's something we need to teach our kids from a young age. It doesn't matter if you like this person. I don't care if you like your teacher or not. You're going to treat them with respect. I don't care if you like your coach or not. You're going to treat them with respect. We'll deal with whatever issues are happening. Dad will deal with that. Okay? We'll go talk to the coach. We'll go talk to the teacher. Whatever. But you're not going to disrespect them. Okay? That type of lesson is only taught adequately within the confines of the home. And so, but, I say that, and then I give this caveat, because the culture is growing progressively more secular and more children find themselves in difficult home situations. There are individuals, young people that might come into into the congregation that maybe come from a difficult home life, or maybe it's a single mom, or maybe the kids are just being brought here by friends or grandparents. As the church grows progressively more secular and away from these moorings of respect for authority, the church has to think about ways in which we can mentor these young people and teaching them how to properly respect positions of authority. If that mantle is not taken up by their family because of other reasons, the church needs to think about, really think about, how can we help these young people to learn how to respect and to honor authority within our culture and within their family. I think it's a very important thing that we need to think about. And it's one of the ways that we minister, for example, to orphans and to kids that are coming out of broken homes. That's the responsibility of the church. One of the primary responsibilities of the church is to respond to these individuals and these kids that need our help. Because a submissive, humble individual is a beautiful thing in the eyes of the Lord. I was recently reading, I cannot remember where I read this, and it was really driving me insane this past week. I could not remember. I was looking through my different books and I couldn't find it. But I did read recently, within the past couple of weeks, I read this sentence and it struck me. It says, treat a man like he is who you want him to be, and not who he is. And one day, he will be. I think it's a good principle to govern ourselves by. Treat people as if they are the person you want them to be, and not necessarily the person they are. And eventually that will have an influence on them. This type of humble respect is going to shine in a culture that grows increasingly more disrespectful and more dishonorable. And these are types of things that we don't necessarily like to hear. We chafe at culture. Our American Texan mindset kind of lends itself towards that kind of predisposition to, kind of bristle against anyone that kind of claims to have authority over us. But we are Christians first. And Scripture must dictate how we treat other individuals. We treat everyone, Scripture says, with honor and respect, but specifically those who are in positions of authority. Because if not, God will hold us accountable, not just simply because we are disrespecting those individuals, but because we are disrespecting God's sovereignty. It is rooted in the defense of His own authority, His own goodness, and His own power that is reflected in the system of authority that He has given in the church, in our homes, and in the government itself. I hope that this lesson's been encouraging to you, maybe has rebuked you a little bit, rebuked me, I know it has, because we need to be reminded of these things at times and to encourage ourselves to reflect the ethic of submission that we see within Scripture. An ethic that trusts in the sovereignty and the power of God to fulfill His will for the promotion of His glory and the promotion of our good. Whatever your need is at this time, why don't you come as together we stand and as we sing.